welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimas.
And I'm Brian Rohlenbacher.
And we have a great show for you today. What do we've got?
In RTB 101, we'll be hearing from Pastor Andrew Corbett on the need for scientific literacy. We know you all love science, and he's going to talk about why it's so important to be up to date on that and be able to share it with other people.
And in Give and Take, Jeff Zweerink will be interviewing biochemist Fazale Rana and philosopher theologian Ken Samples on whether animals are created in God's image.
First up is Culture Talk. Get your flood pants ready because Sandra and astrophysicist Jeff Zweerink are going to be talking about the moon's wobble and whether that will be causing flooding. Let's check it out.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with astrophysicist Jeff Zweerink. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here, Sandra.
You know, I saw something online. It was all over social media, and it was trending even, and it was about the moon's wobble. So according to this article and all of social media, they were saying that the wobble in the moon's orbit plus the effects of climate change will mean that the U.S. will face rapidly increasing high tide floods. So first of all, what was discovered? Because sometimes we get articles that don't quite meet up with what was discovered.
Well, I mean, it makes it sound like we found, this new thing we found out about the moon that's causing things. And the reality is there's an 18-and-a-half-year cycle on how the moon affects the tides. And it's just, I mean, we've known about this cycle for, I think, the 1700s. So there's nothing new about that. But there's two effects that go into the size of the tides and any flooding that might go. One is the water level itself, which is, that's the global, the climate change, how that's affecting sea level. But then the moon, as it gets further and closer away, the tides grow or shrink. So if it's closer, the tides are higher. If it's further away, the tides are less. And that's pretty important. But what this article is looking at is that when the moon is closer, it amplifies the tides. When it's further, it minimizes the tides. So as sea level is rising, the moon can mask that effect on the tides. And so that's really what they found in here, is that it's this combination of two effects. How high is the water from sea level rise, and how do the tides of the moon affect it?
So it sounds like then the new thing is really climate change and the effects that we're seeing happening. Is that correct?
It really does seem like that's the major part of the article. And I actually went through and read the paper because I wanted to say, it wasn't clear to me from any of the popular stuff where we were in that 18-year cycle. And so I was trying to figure that out. And it turns out that if you look at it over the next 30 years, that the tidal effect of the moon for the numbers they were putting out was like 4.5 centimeters of water or height change of water, whereas they're talking about 30 or 40 centimeters for sea level rise. So the moon actually plays a minor role in this whole discussion. It just kind of made for an interesting thing because for the next 10 years, they're going to be getting larger. Then from the 30s to the 40s, the moon will actually be counteracting the rise. And so it's that interplay between the rise and the fall. It means you can't just look at the last 10 years and say, okay, we know what's going on.
Right. So when you say 30s and 40s, you mean 2030 and 2040, that period of time? Okay.
Yeah, so from now to 2030, the moon is kind of amplifying the tides, will make the flooding worse. You go through the 30s, or 2030 to 2040, it's going to minimize the sea level rise and make it look smaller, and then it'll get larger again.
So then the larger part happens in the 2040s to 2050s that we're going to have?
Roughly, yes.
So it'll be the climate change that is now, it's already to a degree, apparently, in the 2040s, 2050s, it's to a degree that the moon's small effect on the tides will then become magnified because it's already the sea levels are already much higher than they have been in the past.
Yeah, and I think the way I would say it is the sea level is rising because the moon is amplifying the tides. We're going to see it a little sooner between the 2020 and 2030. But by the time you get to 2040, the moon is largely irrelevant. You're going to see that sort of flooding just because of the sea level change.
Right. Wow. So then this whole article is really a discussion then about climate change.
It really is, yes,
right.
Where it makes it sound like it's about the moon, and the moon is really a bit player in the bigger story there.
Well, and no pun intended, but that's a hot topic. So especially for Christians, because to even bring that up could be a shutdown of conversation because some people believe that it exists and that humans are responsible and some don't. So how do we engage that? Basically, like our apologetic takeaway, if we're going to have a conversation about things that we see trending in the news, how do we have that conversation in a way that is winsome and also allows for fellow Christians even to have, to feel heard, but also to kind of inform them on a Christian perspective on climate change even.
No, and that's really a key point because, what I've seen are two errors. One is climate change is awful, we're going to destroy the planet.
Right.
And the other is, climate change doesn't exist, we don't need to worry about it. And I think from as a Christian, I find both of those problematic because if you start with the climate change as a hoax, we don't have to worry about it, God's first command to Adam and Eve were to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and then to rule over it and subdue it. That we are given dominion and stewardship. That we're supposed to manage creation well. So to ignore what's going on is a mistake. The other mistake is to think that somehow humanity has the capacity to destroy the planet. I mean, God has really designed this planet well, and we can't inadvertently do it. I think that's just an overstatement of humanity's power, but there's almost this aspect of worshiping the planet and it's more important than humanity. And so I think both of those are errors. And so that's where as a Christian, I can come in and say, yeah, we are supposed to take care of the planet. We're supposed to take care of the people. And so I don't have to convince the person, whoever I'm talking to, they may think climate change is the worst thing in the world, climate change is a hoax. In either instance, I can come in and have a conversation where I'm bringing, hey, God's given us stewardship. We can't just ignore things. God tells us not to worship the planet, that people are important, and those solutions that we find are going to be the ones that take care of both of them. And so in both instances, whether I'm dealing with someone whose climate change is the worst thing in the world or a hoax, I can bring the gospel into that conversation.
Yeah, I really love what you're saying about making it people first, because regardless of where people stand on this issue, at the end of the day, we would hope that they would want what's best for humanity, even if they take the God aspect out of it. Like what is best for humanity, and that's caring for the planet. So.
Well, and I think there's really an important apologetic point there, is that if God is who he says he is, the answers that take care of the planet the best answers that take care of the planet are going to be the ones that take care of people too, and vice versa. So.
Right. Well, all good stuff. Thank you so much for shedding some light on this topic. If you'd like to hear more from Jeff Zweerink, go to reasons.org and search for his blog, Impact Events.
It's just inescapable that in today's culture that science carries a lot of sway, that if you just say, well, latest scientific research shows, people are going to listen, and it may have diminished some over the years, but nonetheless, science has a platform. That would seem to translate into a great need for the pastorate to be very scientifically literate. How have you found that playing out?
Yeah, well, I know that when I was growing up in the church, we were told, don't think too much, just go with your heart. But that just doesn't get any traction today. As a pastor, I've got young people in my church who are either in high school or college who are having supposed scientific information presented to them that allegedly makes the Bible look false and Christianity look ridiculous. And so I think it became necessary for me to at least gain some knowledge of science. And it was when I discovered RTB that it actually brought me up to speed very quickly. And just today's new reasons to believe, the podcasts, they're very easy.
So it's almost like, okay, there's this need in my church. People are asking these questions, and as a pastor, the leader, you've got to be able to interact intelligently, even though you may not be a science expert. You've got to understand the issue.
You've got to at least understand the vocabulary.
Right.
You have to be able to at least know what your reference points are. So to be able to refer people to the Reasons to Believe website and books and so on, to be able to help them, to be able to understand some of the basics of science, I think is now, it's mandatory. It's mandatory for every pastor. It's the jungle that we're trying to reach. These are the natives, this is their language.
And this is where a lot of the attacks and challenges to Christianity come. I mean, they're cased in science says that religion and Christianity in particular is irrelevant and obsolete.
Are opposites, and you're either one or you're the other.
Right.
And of course, when I was a young earther, we were told that the science project was essentially corrupt, that science was essentially blinded by their sin, and they were distorting the data. And when you actually come across, the resources of RTB, you realise that no, science completely concords with Scripture. It comports perfectly with the biblical record.
Well, and I find that position that science is corrupt difficult to tenet, because there's a lot of scientists that I worked with that were strong Christians, and so it's an inconsistent position based on my experience.
And of course, Scripture encourages us to be scientific.
Right.
It encourages us to consider the heavens. It encourages us to look to the heavens, that they display the glory of God. Right. Romans chapter 1 says people are without excuse, basically for scientific reasons.
Well, and the first command, be fruitful, rule over, multiply, be fruitful, multiply, rule over, fill the earth. How do we rule and subdue the earth without understanding how it works?
Sure.
Science is that tool.
Yeah. So when you actually look at the whole of Scripture, you understand that it doesn't discourage science, it actually encourages science. And so being able to draw on the work of yourself and Hugh and Fuzz and Ken to be able to see how science and Scripture declare the glory of the one God. Right. And they are two books speaking about the same thing, God and His glory and His redemptive plan. So I think it's just necessary now for every pastor to have some scientific literacy, to be able to share with people in his church, particularly young people who are off to college, who are being bombarded with anti-Christian messages all the time. And just sometimes it's just a simple thing to say, there is another scientific way of looking at this same thing, and yet it believes in the God of the Bible.
Right. I think that's a good point, is that very often, today's culture, science is portrayed as an enemy of the Christian faith. And if we're going to equip people in congregations to deal with that, we've got to be scientifically literate. We've got to be able to address those issues. And as we do it well, ultimately, it will strengthen the faith of those who are Christians. And that's an important thing to do.
Hello, Jeff Zweerink. Welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas to help you be more confident in the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by my friends and colleagues, Dr. Fazale Rana and Professor Ken Samples, and we are going to look at whether animals have the image of God. Ken, Fuzz, good to have you here today.
Hi, Jeff.
So this George Haraxon, a good friend of ours, works here with us, had a student basically make the argument that because animals are created with a purpose, they share in God's image and they should have a right to life just like humans do. And I thought this is a great topic because it has scientific ramifications and theological ramifications. And so, Ken, let's start out with some of the theological. Is it true that being created with a purpose means that you're made in God's image?
I don't think that's correct at all. I think a clear reading of Scripture indicates that the only beings that are made in the image of God are humans, excluding both animals and even angels. And I think we see that even in the book of Genesis 2:7, the dust of the ground, the breath of life. Animals are also from the dust of the ground, but there's no indication that they have the breath of life or the imago Dei.
So this would have implications for, are humans actually unique or set apart in God's creation, or are we just the latest, greatest human, that sort of thing? I know historically it seems like humans, at least from a theological perspective, are always seen as separated from the rest of creation.
I think it's fair to say that the imago Dei would convey the idea of a difference, not just in degree, but in kind. And of course, that doesn't rule out that animals have real value and that according to creation care, we would care for them. But the idea that animals would bear the image of God, I don't see it. In fact, in the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul talks about the image, he doesn't point to even Adam, he points to Christ.
So when we talk about the image of God, what does that mean for humanity?
Well, Christians are divided. There are differing ideas. I think the classical position is the correct view, that we resemble God, that we have these qualities and characteristics, intellectual qualities, moral qualities, spiritual qualities. Today, it's popular for people to say a relational view, like the members of the Trinity, we can relate to each other, or that we represent God as vice-regents. My view, however, is you have to resemble God to then relate or to represent.
So, in terms of looking at how we compare to animal, or looking at the differences or distinctions and similarities with animals, are there any of those views of the image of God that blur the distinction between humans and animals?
Not to my mind. I mean, I think those qualities, whether they're intellectual, moral, or spiritual qualities, they're different in kind than the animals. And then relating or representing, I don't think the animals could involve themselves. And I think it's interesting.
Even though certain animals can relate to one another and to humans, so there's still some sort of distinction there.
Right, and they have consciousness. In some ways, they have a giftedness that exceeds human beings, but in a very different way. They don't read, they don't write, they don't do philosophy, they didn't invent science. So there are differences. But again, I would propose that that doesn't mean we don't think animals have real value.
No, and I think that's a very important point, and we'll kind of circle back to that. Fuzz, I'd like to turn to some of the scientific implications, because how we look at animals and humans and creation, in a very real sense, our worldview has a tremendous impact in what we look for scientifically. So how does this idea of animals having the image of God, how does that cash out in terms of scientifically? What do we look at?
Well, I suspect the student that raised this point was probably influenced, whether he or she realized it or not, by the evolutionary paradigm. Because when Darwin comes along and proposes the idea of human evolution, he was making the case that everything about us as human beings that we think makes us exceptional has an antecedent in the hominins that precede us, and hence that we're only different in degree, not kind, from other creatures, particularly hominins like Neanderthals or Homo erectus. And so the idea here is that human beings are no different really than any other creature that exists. We have no inherent worth or value. We're just part of this evolutionary tree of life, and that we really arise as a result of a happenstance, a historical evolutionary happenstance. There's no purpose or meaning ultimately to human existence. And so out of that flows this idea that again, humans are no more or less valuable than any other organism on the planet, and to make the claim otherwise is to be guilty of speciesism, which is akin to racism, and it's a highly offensive view in the academy today. It's considered to be arrogant to think that human beings would be exceptional or more valuable or stand apart from other creatures.
So what is there any scientific evidence that weighs in favor of us being exceptional, not just the latest, greatest, but something truly different in kind, not just degree?
Well, over the last 150 years, this idea that we differ only in degree, not kind, really has shaped anthropology. And in recent years, there's a growing number of anthropologists who actually agree that we really are different in kind, not degree, from other creatures, including Neanderthals. And what seems to make us stand apart is our ability to represent the world symbolically, and out of that would be language and art and music, but also that we have a theory of mind, that we recognize that other people have minds like us, and therefore we know what they're thinking, we know what they're feeling, and that allows us to kind of integrate and interconnect our minds with one another in a complex social structures. And I see these as scientific descriptors of the image of God.
So I know there are people, just in interacting with you and some of the scientific literature I've read, will point out, well, we bury our dead, that's a sign of the image of God, or that's a reflection of the image of God, and that other animals bury their dead and they have this kind of reverence for their dead. It seems like that kind of blurs that distinction rather than actually makes the case for human exceptionalism.
Well, one thing we have to be very careful about is our tendency to anthropomorphize as humans. And that ability and tendency to anthropomorphize flows out of theory of mind. And because of that, we treat inanimate objects as if they are like us. We treat animals as if they are like us. And so we interpret animal behavior to be more human-like than it actually is. I mean, there's a lot of animals that cache the dead, that dispose of the dead. And there are reasons why animals might be perceived as mourning the dead, when in fact there may be other functions to that, like helping to restructure the social hierarchy within a group when a key member dies, or a mother ape may carry around a dead infant, and that may be a reflection of an intense motherhood, instinct for motherhood more so than an actual mourning.
So it does seem like, if I get what you're saying, that we do see behaviors in the animal realm that are reflections somewhat of humanity, if you will, are similar, but we tend to read more into that because of our exceptional nature, if you will. So yes. I don't ever see a dog looking at me saying, wow, I wonder if he's sad about today. I mean, so if that's kind of where you're going with that. So. Yeah. So it really does seem like humans are exceptional, both theologically and scientifically. There's quite a bit of evidence for that. Well, thanks. I appreciate your comments today, Ken and Fuzz. Yeah. It really is a growing thought in our society today that humans are just the latest, greatest creature, that we are not different in kind, but different in degree. But when we look at it from a theological perspective and from a scientific perspective, we actually find an abundance of evidence that humans are truly exceptional. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org. Fuzz has written an article, and there's many articles, but go to reasons.org and check out Fuzz's article on primate thanatology and the case for human exceptionalism. It helps you get introduced to this topic and help you to be able to respond well to those who claim that animals are just like people too.
That does it for us this week on 2819. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that it helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
And don't forget, subscribe to the show and search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And if you want the podcast version, you can get us on most major podcast services. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
See you next week.
Bye.